But so, the town turns all the Mac to our pool. Send the sign or in I crane.
At the moment Wirecard's market value exceeded Deutsche Bank's, nobody asked the most obvious question. Where the hell was the money? Not metaphorically. Literally. 1.9 billion euros in bank accounts that, when auditors finally looked, turned out to be fictional. Completely made up. A clean audit opinion certifying the financial statements provided a true and fair view from one of the Big Four, Ernst & Young, for nearly a decade, while the company was cooking the books so aggressively that the Philippines banking system had to issue a statement denying Wirecard was even a client. So here's what we're actually investigating. Not why fraud happened. Why did every institutional safeguard designed to stop it fail in sequence, and then fail again when the market tried to self-correct? The documents are unsparing. BaFin, Germany's financial regulator, had warnings starting in 2015. Serious warnings, not rumors. A Financial Times investigation. An analyst report explicitly naming fraud and money laundering. Short sellers with detailed research. Whistleblowers. And BaFin's response was to ban the short sellers from trading for 2 months while filing a criminal complaint against the journalists who were reporting the truth. Let's look at what they actually put in writing. Wirecard was founded in 1999 as a payment processor. By 2018, it had moved into the DAX, Germany's top stock index. In June 2020, it filed for bankruptcy, acknowledging that 1.9 billion euros were missing. That's the shape of the collapse. But the documents we're examining were produced in 3 very different moments, and they tell us something about how institutions respond when evidence of fraud becomes undeniable. First, in November 2020, 4 months after Wirecard folded, the European Parliament's Economic Governance Support Unit commissioned a policy briefing from academic experts, Katja Langenbucher, Christian Lois, Jan-Peter Kronen, Loriana Pelazan. Their mandate was explicit. Analyze the supervisory failures. What went wrong and why? That's source 3, and it's the most recent institutional postmortem. Second, in 2025, Cambridge University Press published a forensic linguistics study of the Enron collapse. A different case entirely, but the authors, Matteo Fuoli, Adam Nix, Alicia Wickert, and Nina Van Riper, were analyzing something crucial: how trust is built and manipulated in conversation. They had access to 505 recorded phone calls between Enron traders during the California energy crisis. Real conversations, real fraud happening in real time on tape. That study doesn't mention Wirecard at all, but read alongside the Wirecard documents. It explains the mechanics of how external actors, clients, partners, regulators, get pulled into networks where fraud becomes normalized. Third, a thematic digest produced by the European Parliament in November 2020, summarizing 3 separate external papers commissioned to examine Wirecard's wider supervisory implications. This isn't one author's analysis. It's the European Parliament trying to understand what happened across the entire oversight system. Why these 3 sources matter together. Wirecard and Enron are separated by 2 decades and 2 continents. Different industries, different regulatory regimes. But the European Parliament's analysis, published just months after Wirecard's collapse, kept returning to Enron as a reference point. Not because the cases were identical, because the institutional failures were structurally identical. In Enron's case, Texas, 2001, the company manipulated electricity markets in California. Traders on recorded phone calls instructed partners to shut down power generators, to falsify schedules, to move energy across state lines to avoid price caps, all while managing trust with clients, regulators, and internal partners through carefully calibrated language. The auditors, Arthur Anderson, issued clean opinions. The regulators didn't intervene. Then the company collapsed. What happened next? Sarbanes-Oxley was passed in 2002. The Public Company Accounting Oversight Board was created. New rules, new oversight, new penalties for auditors. Fast forward 20 years. Wirecard, same structure. Internal controls fail. External auditors issue clean opinions for years, while red flags accumulate. Whistleblowers are ignored or actively suppressed. The regulator BaFin has the power to act, but doesn't, not forcefully. And when the market tries to correct itself through short selling, the regulator bans it. The European Parliament's analysis concludes that despite everything learned from Enron, The German and European systems had structural weaknesses that were worse than Enron-era failures in some respects. That's what we need to understand. The stakes aren't just about fraud. They're about whether regulatory systems actually learn, or whether they just rearrange themselves to look different while leaving the core vulnerabilities untouched. The third source, the forensic linguistics study, sits in a different register entirely. Foley and his team weren't commissioned by regulators. They were analyzing how Enron traders use language to build trust with external actors who didn't know they were participating in fraud. They examined 415,000 words of recorded conversations. Traders telling clients that Enron's market moves were legitimate, building emotional bonds, sharing insider information selectively, creating a sense of partnership and shared ideology. What the linguistic study reveals is that fraud at this scale doesn't function through deception alone. It functions through trust. Real, functional trust built through discourse. Clients trusted Enron because Enron traders projected competence and benevolence, because they created ideological alignment, framing California's regulations as irrational, positioning themselves as the rational actors responding to market signals. The trust was sometimes genuine on the other side. External actors weren't always victims of conscious deception. They were participants in networks where corruption had become normalized. That matters because the European Parliament's analysis of Wirecard reaches a similar conclusion. The company wasn't just defrauding investors. It was building and maintaining trust networks. Auditors, clients, partners, internal staff, all of them believed in Wirecard, partly because the company had successfully built trust infrastructure. And when trust exists, when you've shared privileged information, when you're part of an in-group facing a common external threat, in Enron's case, California regulators, in Wirecard's case, skeptical journalists and short sellers, the incentive structure shifts. You stop asking hard questions, you start protecting the network. That's the connecting tissue between all three sources, not just institutional failure, institutional capture. Systems don't panic, they adjust. Let's look at what they actually put in writing. The European Parliament's analysis of Wirecard opens with this. Until its collapse, Wirecard successfully marketed itself as a pioneer and innovator in the digital payments industry, as a fintech that was able to displace the big banks. At one point, its market capitalization was bigger than that of Deutsche Bank. With hindsight, however, it seems that weak regulation and supervision facilitated the company's quick development into a blue-chip company, which turned out to be less substantiated than perceived. Weak regulation. Not fraud, not deception by the company. Weak regulation that times facilitated timeless. That's the institutional diagnosis right there. But here's where it gets specific. The same analysis found that Wirecard was left to operate under a veil of regulatory ignorance, with no effective challenge to the viability of its business model. A veil of regulatory ignorance. Nobody was checking whether the business actually worked. They just accepted it. And then, Wirecard and firms like Wirecard operate in a global economy. Supervision that is only at the local level is likely to fall short of its objectives. So the system's own analysis admits it wasn't equipped to handle what Wirecard was doing. It knew that in advance, built the system anyway. Now let's look at what the auditors were actually doing. Ernst & Young issued clean audit opinions for Wirecard's financials from 2009 to 2018. The European Parliament's briefing notes that EY was content with balance confirmations for large escrow accounts at Singapore's second-largest bank issued in the name of a trustee. Content. They accepted documentation that was provided by an intermediary. They didn't verify it directly. And then KPMG's forensic investigation, commissioned by Wirecard itself in October 2019, found that KPMG cannot make any statement as a result of the forensic investigation activities carried out with regard to the investigation period, 2016 to 2018, that the sales revenues exist and are correct in terms of their amount, nor can it make any statement that the sales revenues do not exist and are incorrect in terms of their amount. They couldn't even say whether the money existed. But EY had said it did, for nearly a decade. One firm says yes, another firm says we literally cannot determine yes or no. The second firm was forensic investigators brought in after the fraud was suspected. The first firm was the statutory auditor who certified the financials year after year. The math balances, but the logic doesn't. But here's what's crucial. The Enron linguistic study examined 505 phone calls between traders during the California energy crisis. In one of them, an Enron trader named BW instructs an operator at a power plant, "Tonight, when you finish your normal QF, we want you guys to get a little creative and come up with a reason to go down." Go down, meaning shut down the generator. Create a false maintenance reason. This was market manipulation happening in real time. And the study found that this worked because trust had been built. The operator didn't immediately refuse. The operator had been brought into Enron's network through previous interactions, shared information, ideological alignment. The study concludes, Enron traders could not have manipulated California's electricity markets on their own. Their strategies relied on securing the trust of external organizations. External trust, partners, regulators, clients. All of them had to believe Enron was legitimate. And they did. The same pattern emerges in Wirecard. The European Parliament's briefing notes that Wirecard could also pass the hurdle of the scrutiny of large investors and banks, which provided massive funding to its operations. Two consortia of banks gave Wirecard significant new debt in 2018 and 2019. The briefing adds, the former consortium apparently did not insist in the debt contract on having access to the more detailed, non-public audit report, but instead relied on the public audit opinion and the credit rating. They relied on EY's clean opinion. They trusted the system. Systems don't panic. They adjust. The Enron study identifies something it calls distrust sequences, moments when someone expresses skepticism and the fraudster has to repair trust through denial, justification, or blame shifting. One tape captures an ISO operator directly confronting an Enron trader. "What customers? You don't have any." "How can you have customers if you're already exporting 44 megawatts? The trader responds, "I'm not exporting. I bought those megawatts outside at Palo Verde from the PX." Denying, reframing, creating an alternative explanation. The study notes this works because it's offered confidently by someone who's already established credibility. In Wirecard's case, the European Parliament's briefing reveals a similar pattern. When Financial Times journalists published investigations into Wirecard's accounting in January 2019, BaFin prohibited increases in net short sale positions for a period of 2 months. BaFin banned the short sellers. Not the company being investigated, the sellers. And here's the critical detail. Some investors may have inferred mistakenly from the intervention that BaFin possessed private information that the short sellers were actually wrong. The regulator's action created the impression of BaFin's confidence in Wirecard. It was a trust repair mechanism. But it wasn't repairing trust in the truth. It was repairing trust in the lie. Let's look at what happened when the doubts actually surfaced. The European Parliament's timeline shows that in January 2019, the Financial Times published its first article on Wirecard's Singapore operations. In February 2019, BaFin directed FREP Germany's Financial Reporting Enforcement Panel to examine Wirecard's accounts. FREP assigned a single auditor to the case, one person. For a DAX-listed company with operations across multiple continents and a business model that nobody could verify. The briefing notes that FREP is a private entity appointed by the government. The body is widely seen as a comparatively weak institution, being dependent on the consent and cooperation of the corporation it investigates, and working on a very limited budget of around €6 million in 2019. €6 million. A private body. No subpoena power, dependent on the company's cooperation. And the system was designed so that BaFin couldn't take over the investigation unless FREP reported non-cooperation or improper execution. The study of this institutional architecture is damning. A Germany-specific two-step enforcement structure has made the system prone to latency and unclear responsibilities. Latency, delay, the time between when red flags appear and when anyone with actual power can act. And Enron's traders were weaponizing that latency in their favor. The linguistics study shows traders discussing their strategies openly because the regulatory response was slow. One trader says about their market gaming tactics, "We have been doing for 2 years a lot of activity in, there's black, there's white, and there's gray. We have been endeavoring into the gray area when opportunities present themselves, gray area. Operating in the space between legal and clearly illegal, because that space exists. because enforcement is slow, because trust in your ability to navigate it has been established. And finally, this. The Enron linguistics study examined how frequently different trust-building moves appeared in traders' conversations. They found that share privileged information, basically, admitting to fraud with people you've brought into your network, was extraordinarily common. In phase 1 of the crisis, it accounted for 20.55% of all coded trust management discourse. The study concludes the exceptionally high frequency of the share privileged information move during this phase reflects low perceptions of risk and perhaps a sense of hubris amid the lucrative wave of market gaming, as well as the extent to which such practices had become normalized. Fraud had been incorporated into the operational culture. It wasn't hidden. It was celebrated. The study shows traders praising each other for successful manipulations. "You're the man," one trader says. "Good," another responds. "Success equals market gaming." By the time external scrutiny arrived, the entire internal network had been structured around the assumption that this was legitimate business. That's where Wirecard's analysis becomes most damning. The European Parliament notes that Wirecard's West Power division had formalized this knowledge into a set of trading strategies. This is about Enron, not Wirecard, but it applies. And that these strategies, once routinized and embedded in the division's operations, allowed Enron's traders to systematically exploit the new market's weaknesses. Routinized. Embedded. Once fraud is embedded in operations, and everyone in the organization knows about it and benefits from it, the external signals, the whistleblowers, the journalists, the short sellers, the auditors, internal doubts, they don't register as danger. They register as noise, interference from people who don't understand the game. The math balances, but the logic doesn't. Here's the argument. Regulatory systems don't fail to prevent fraud. They are systematically structured to tolerate it. Not consciously, not through explicit conspiracy, but through institutional design that prioritizes process over outcome, compliance over truth, and the appearance of oversight over actual oversight. The evidence is in the architecture itself. Wirecard operated for years under a veil of regulatory ignorance. That wasn't an accident. It was the default state. The system wasn't designed to aggressively verify the business model of every fintech company. It was designed to check boxes. And when red flags emerged, Financial Times investigations, short seller reports, whistleblower complaints, the institutional response wasn't to investigate harder. It was to defend the institution. BaFin banned the short sellers, filed criminal complaints against journalists, slowed the enforcement process through a two-step procedure that required a private body to move first, with limited budget and no subpoena power. The system adjusted. It didn't panic. It protected itself. And the auditors, Ernst & Young, operated within the same framework. They weren't negligent in some personal sense. They were following the audit model as it exists. Check documentation, verify compliance with standards, issue an opinion. They weren't tasked with finding fraud. They were tasked with certifying that the financials complied with IFRS. The gap between those two things, between compliance and truth, is where Wirecard lived. The system is structured to tolerate that gap. Enron revealed this flaw in 2001. Sarbanes-Oxley was supposed to close it. 20 years later, Wirecard operated using the same gap. Different country, different industry, same structural vulnerability. That's not a failure of learning. That's a feature of the system. The strongest objection is this. Fraud is fundamentally hard to detect. Sophisticated fraudsters will find gaps. No system can prevent all deception. You can't inspect your way to honesty. And the Wirecard case itself provides evidence for this. KPMG, brought in specifically to investigate, found that Wirecard had created an escrow account structure deliberately designed to obscure verification. They used third-party acquirers. They operated across multiple jurisdictions. They forged documentation. This wasn't naive incompetence. This was calculated deception. So isn't it unfair to blame the regulatory system for being unable to detect something that was specifically engineered not to be detected? The answer is yes and no. Yes, fraud is hard to catch. But no, that's not the problem here. The problem isn't that Wirecard fooled the system. The problem is that the system was never organized to look. When the Financial Times published investigations in 2015 and 2019, that was external actors doing the work. When short sellers built detailed research models questioning Wirecard's numbers, that was external market pressure. When a whistleblower inside EY flagged fraud allegations in May 2016, EY conducted an investigation that was shut down by Wirecard management, not the supervisory board, not the regulator. The company itself killed the internal investigation, and nobody from outside stepped in. The system had the information. It didn't act. The European Parliament's analysis is explicit about this. EY had an internal whistleblower in May 2016 who raised fraud allegations against Wirecard and reported an attempt to bribe an auditor in India. This incident triggered an investigation by EY, which supposedly shared information with its group audit team, but was eventually shut down at the behest of Wirecard management. At the behest, the company told the auditor to stop investigating, and the auditor complied. That's not a failure to detect deception. That's a failure to exercise authority when deception becomes visible. And here's where the institutional design becomes clear. An auditor's job description includes an obligation to report suspected fraud, but the auditor is hired and fired by the company, paid by the company. The auditor's entire economic existence depends on the company's satisfaction. That's not a design flaw. That's the design. And when the company says, "Stop investigating," the power dynamic is not symmetrical. The Enron linguistics study demonstrates this precisely. Traders built trust with auditors, with regulators, with clients, with internal staff. They did this through language, through shared ideology, through selective information sharing, through displays of confidence and competence. Once that trust was established, dissent became heresy. One trader, when confronted about market manipulation, didn't deny it outright. He reframed it. There's black, there's white, and there's gray. We have been endeavoring into the gray area when opportunities present themselves. Gray area. Operating in uncertainty. And the person he's talking to doesn't push back, because they've been brought into the ideological framework. They've benefited from the trades. They've shared in the profits. They're part of the in-group. So when the whistleblower inside EY tried to flag fraud in May 2016, they were trying to dissent from an ideology that had been successfully embedded in the organization. Wirecard was a success story, a fintech pioneer, a DAX company. The market had validated it. Investors had funded it. The question wasn't whether Wirecard was committing fraud. The question was whether you were the kind of person who questioned a success story. And most people, when that question is posed implicitly through institutional pressure, answer no. They go along. They protect the network. That's not individual failure. That's structural. So the thesis is this. The system isn't designed to find fraud. It's designed to prevent obvious fraud while tolerating sophisticated fraud. It's designed to maintain the appearance of oversight while accepting that auditors, regulators, and internal controls will all find reasons, legitimate reasons, reasonable reasons, not to look too hard. And when someone does look hard, the system adjusts. It protects itself through process, through jurisdictional ambiguity, through the two-step procedure that delays action, through banning the short sellers instead of investigating the company, through filing criminal complaints against journalists instead of investigating the allegations. That's not corruption in the crude sense. That's not a regulator taking bribes. That's institutional self-preservation operating at the level of policy design. And it works because the people inside the system aren't evil. They're reasonable. They're following procedures. Ernst & Young's auditors were following audit standards. BaFin's officials were following enforcement procedures. The supervisory board at Wirecard was operating within corporate governance norms. Each actor individually was behaving rationally within the constraints of the system. But the system itself is structured so that rational individual behavior produces irrational collective outcomes. Fraud gets tolerated. Red flags get ignored. Whistleblowers get shut down. And then, when the fraud is exposed after billions in losses, everybody says it's a scandal and promises reform. Sarbanes-Oxley was supposed to fix this. It didn't. The Wirecard analysis documents 8 recommendations for European reform, and you know what they are? Strengthen auditor liability. Require internal control audits. Create an audit committee with financial experts. Require whistleblower protections. Improve information flows. Strengthen enforcement powers. These are the same fixes proposed after Enron. 20 years of reform recommendations, repeated, which means either the reforms don't work or they're not being implemented. Either way, the system is still broken. Systems don't panic, they adjust. The question that follows from all this is whether the system can be reformed within its current structure, or whether the structure itself is the problem. The European Parliament proposes creating a European single capital market supervisor, a hub-and-spoke model with national agencies reporting to a central authority. That's structural reform. It's acknowledging that the current fragmented national system enables regulatory arbitrage. Wirecard operated across multiple jurisdictions. Supervision was only local, so they recommend centralizing oversight. But notice what's not being questioned: the audit model itself. Auditors will still be hired by companies, still be paid by companies, still depend on company satisfaction. The proposal to strengthen auditor liability is a bandage. It doesn't change the underlying incentive misalignment. You can't solve a principal-agent problem by raising penalties if the agency structure remains fundamentally compromised. And the whistleblower protections, valuable as they are, address individual courage, not institutional design. They say, be brave enough to report fraud. They don't say, redesign the system so that fraud isn't embedded in the operational culture, because that would require questioning whether certain forms of organizational structure are compatible with honesty. And that's a conversation capitalism doesn't want to have. So the reforms will be implemented. Audit committees will be created. Whistleblower hotlines will be established. Enforcement powers will be strengthened. And in 10 years, there will be another fraud of similar scale. Different company, different industry, same structural vulnerability. And the analysis will again conclude that all the lines of defense fail. Which is true, but only because we're defending the wrong structure. Here is what you should understand. Regulatory systems are not broken. They are working exactly as designed. They are designed to tolerate fraud at a certain scale while maintaining the institutional legitimacy required for capital markets to function. That's not a conspiracy. That's institutional mathematics. You need enough oversight to prevent obvious crude fraud, the kind that immediately destroys confidence. You need enough penalties to deter the reckless. You need enough auditor liability to maintain the appearance that someone is checking. But you cannot have so much oversight that you actually catch sophisticated fraud before it creates value for the people embedded in the system. Because if you caught it too early, you'd have to admit that the system itself produces fraud, and if you admit that, you can't maintain trust in the system. So the system calibrates. Catch some fraud, miss others, punish individual perpetrators while leaving the structure intact, implement reforms that look serious but don't change the underlying incentives. Wirecard was a fraud. Ernst & Young missed it. The AFIN didn't investigate forcefully. The European Parliament published 8 recommendations for reform. None of them question whether auditors should be hired by the companies they audit. None of them propose that regulators should have sufficient resources and speed to actually investigate financial anomalies in real time. None of them suggest that the 2-step enforcement procedure should be abolished entirely. They propose modest improvements to a system that everyone knows is inadequate. And those improvements will be implemented. Audit committees will be stronger. Whistleblower protections will expand. Enforcement powers will marginally increase. And the system will still tolerate the next fraud because the structure that produces fraud will still be in place. That is not a prediction of failure. That is a description of how the system functions. Systems don't panic. They adjust. The question the sources raise but cannot answer is this: can a system designed to tolerate fraud be reformed to prevent it without destroying the entire institution? The European Parliament assumes yes. The Wirecard analysis proposes specific reforms. It proposes creating a European single capital market supervisor, centralizing oversight, strengthening enforcement. Those are reasonable proposals. They might even work. They might catch the next Wirecard 6 months earlier. But they don't address the fundamental problem, which is not supervisory architecture. It's trust. The Enron linguistics study shows that fraud at scale requires trust networks. External actors, clients, regulators, auditors, have to believe the fraudster is legitimate. They have to be brought into an ideological framework where the fraud seems reasonable. And that trust is built through language, through selective information sharing, through displays of competence and benevolence, through creating in-groups and common enemies. All of those mechanisms are normal in business. They're how business works. How do you prevent fraud through trust-building language without preventing business communication? You can't. So the system has to accept that trust can be exploited. It has to build verification mechanisms. But verification mechanisms don't work if they're performed by people who've been brought into the trust network. which is why auditors fail. They've been embedded in the company. They've benefited from the fees. They've been socialized into the organizational ideology. And by the time they're skeptical enough to push back, they're already compromised. Is there a structural solution to that? I don't know. The sources don't address it. But I suspect the answer is that you'd have to separate verification from economic dependence entirely. You'd have to have auditors who have no financial relationship to the company, who can't be hired or fired by the company, who report to a regulator, not to a supervisory board. And if you did that, you'd fundamentally change the economics of auditing. The costs would be massive. The system as it currently exists couldn't absorb those costs. So instead, the system adjusts. It tolerates fraud. It implements reforms that look serious but don't address the structural problem. And it continues. So what should you do with this? First, stop trusting institutional explanations of fraud. When a scandal happens and the response is a policy briefing with 8 recommendations, understand that those recommendations are calibrated not to fix the system, but to preserve it. The system will implement reforms. The system will strengthen auditors and regulators. The system will catch some fraud. But the system's structural tolerance for fraud will remain intact. Second, understand that when you see headlines about a major corporate scandal, what you're seeing is not the discovery of fraud. You're seeing the moment when fraud became too visible to contain. Wirecard's fraud didn't start in 2019, it started years earlier. It was visible to people inside the system. What changed in 2019 was that it became visible to people outside the system. The Financial Times reported it. Short sellers quantified it. Whistleblowers spoke. The system adjusted by attacking those external observers instead of investigating the company. When that failed, it investigated. But that's not the system working. That's the system failing to suppress the truth and then acting as if it's fixing the problem. Third, recognize that auditors and regulators are not external check on the system. They're part of the system. They're embedded in it. They depend on it economically. When they certify financial statements, when they approve market behavior, when they issue clean audit opinions, they're not providing independent verification. They're providing institutional legitimacy. And institutional legitimacy is a commodity that's in constant demand, so the system will always find people willing to provide it. The math balances, but the logic doesn't, and it will keep not balancing until the structure changes. That's the unresolved question the sources point to but don't answer. Is the structure changeable? Or is fraud tolerance built so fundamentally into how capital markets function that any attempt to remove it would collapse the entire system? I don't know. But I know that pretending the system can be reformed without